Okay, welcome back, everybody. So let's continue with the afternoon session. And our first speaker is Thomas Uebel.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to join you in reflecting about philosophy of science in general. I should warn you that after the very clear and persuasive presentations in the morning, I'm going to take you over to the dark side of logical empiricism, because my aim is to answer one of the questions on the invite, whether logical empiricism still holds lessons that have somewhat been missed. In order to do that, I will try to identify the one group of practitioners of whom I think this is most likely. And after specifying their relevant conceptions and convictions, I will try to determine what, if any, those lessons may be and whether they amount to any unfinished business. So given the time constraints, I'll have to be extremely sketchy and must keep the many caveats my story requires for the discussion period. So here's at least my basic sort of plot, the overview. The group in question is what's called, sometimes called the left wing of the Vienna Circle, but it's also been called by the same person the Unified Science Group. Who that is, I'll tell you in a moment. The Unified Science Group that includes Carnap, Frank, Hahn, and Neurath. This group held some very radical views, even by current standards. So the interpretive task, therefore, is, or the way I conceive of it, is to clarify their radical doctrines, make clear what were they actually after, without normalizing them unduly, so keeping a little bit of frisson to them, right? What was it about? In a nutshell, they rejected philosophy as an autonomous discipline with its own knowledge sources. Instead, they adopted a methodological naturalism which recognized only empirical and formal science as resources for cognitive claims. They were uncommon in not only being fallibilist and holist and non-reductive, but also in being constructivist. So that's a strange form of naturalism, but be that as it may. So the unfinished business question is really whether there's any aspect of their program that is still viable, or better saying, whether there's any of the uncommon aspects that's still viable. All right. So importantly about those names, Left Vienna Circle, Unified Science Group, is that they are self-describing agents categories. They were Neurath's terms, which he used in correspondence in the early 30s, and they were importantly adopted by Carnap. He used them, for instance, in his autobiography, but even earlier on, they turn up in little writings. What they do, they express opposition to Schlick's Wittgensteinian wing of the Vienna Circle. Importantly, then, the term Left Vienna Circle has a double meaning, as the synonymy with Unified Science Group indicates. It designates both a socio-political and a philosophical position. But since I'm concerned here with the philosophical position of these people, I will speak generally of the Unified Science Group, so we're not distracted by those overtones that also distracted Schlick, by the way, but that's another matter. So what is the philosophical distinction of the Unified Science Group? First of all, they promoted a radical physicalism. And in that point, in that respect, interesting, they were also opposed by Zilsel, which is why Zilsel, even though politically on the same side as them, doesn't really belong to the Left Vienna Circle the way Neurath describes them, right? But apart from promoting radical physicalism, which allows no room, no phenomenologically or phenomenalistically interesting room in epistemology for, private languages, cognition or something. They rejected, importantly, and this is what Carnap stressed, strict verificationism, which was promoted by Schlick following Wittgenstein. They rejected the tractarian opposition to meta-logic and meta-languages. And they also rejected the idea that philosophy had a distinct source of knowledge, not in rational intuition. Schlick rejected that as well, but also in meaning determination, which for Schlick still distinguished philosophy from the rest. For them, for the Unified Science Group, these differences made for a new conception of philosophy as a meta-theory of science. For them, philosophy becomes science, albeit in a self-reflexive mode. This new conception emerged along with this group itself as a distinctive faction in the early 1930s as a rarely explicitly discussed but nevertheless common denominator of their philosophical efforts. Importantly, this meta-theory conception of philosophy is what I sometimes call bipartite. It has two parts. It combines formally and empirically oriented investigations and thinks of them as compatible by way of a division of labor. So contrary to first impressions, Carnap, the rational reconstructionist, and Neurath, the naturalist, they're actually intended to be working together, albeit on different aspects of analyzing the scientific enterprise. So Carnap's logic of science investigates scientific theories in typically axiomatized forms, considers their internal structure and their relation to their evidential base in purely logical terms. It concerns abstract frameworks of reasoning and relations of evidential support, independently of the particularities of concrete applications. By contrast, what Neurath called the behavioristics of science, and Frank much later rebaptized the pragmatics of science, I'll prefer Frank's name, that investigates scientific practice by means of the empirical sciences of science, namely psychology, sociology, economics, and history of science. It focuses on concrete theory choices and theory changes and on data processing and evidence gathering and that kind of stuff in complex but concrete empirical contexts. Now, importantly, both logic and pragmatics of science had an eye to best practice insofar as they thought to make proposals for improving what Frank called the instrument of science, or the instrument science, never even mine. And now there was obviously a normative element there, but that normative element was purely instrumental, oriented towards cognitive success, be that prediction or kind of explanation. So that's all pretty good, but at one point you might say, well, hang on, you're forgetting something. All these guys were anti-philosophy. They couldn't stand the idea of philosophy. Neurath spoke of anti-philosophy, but even Carnap prefaced his unity of science with a bold assertion saying, the Vienna Circle does not do philosophy. Right? So here's a quote, I'll skip that. But what does this amount to? I think what their anti-philosophy animus amounts to is that they rejected the idea of trying to discover the true reality behind appearances, the idea of defeating skepticism for once and all time, or to determine purely by a priori reasoning how we all must concern ourselves morally. Instead, they invented, or they thought of themselves as inventing a new discipline, namely philosophy of science as a self-conscious alternative to what they saw as a multiply confused tradition, an alternative that proceeds scientifically by applying formal and empirical science to science itself. Right? So, needless to say, full-scale realizations of this program are hard to find. And, but I think this leaves the program intact, and there's enough traces in their writings all over the place to see that that's, for a while, what they all were aimed at. Note, therefore, that focusing on that program, that a philosophy of science that proceeds by applying formal and empirical science to science itself sounds very much like a naturalistic enterprise, strikingly anticipatory of later 20th century developments. At which point, of course, you'll say, hang on, this is far too fast. What about Carnap's intentionalism, given Neurath's opposition to semantics? What about Quine's opposition to the analytic-synthetic distinction? How does that go along with naturalism? What about naturalism's much vaunted anti-a prioricism? And what about, finally, the global anti-metaphysics of the Vienna Circle? How do you suddenly want to clean it up and tell us this is all naturalism? Well, clearly, this is the closest to a caveat. I've got lots packed into that. Understanding the USG program preserves certain clarifications. You might call them idealizations, but they have their place here. What would example, Neurath simply missed, when he had his big clash with Carnap over semantics, Neurath simply misunderstood that truth for Carnap was a deflationist, not a correspondentist notion, and therefore got on his anti-metaphysical horse. Quine, in turn, missed that Carnap's analytical truths were formal artifacts employed in the service of explicating the vagaries of ordinary and the residual obscurities of scientific language, and they did not constitute or describe pre-existent Platonic meaning relations. Right? Likewise, for the presumed prescription of all a priori reasoning, Carnap's logical pluralism entailed a form of conventionalism that allows and requires only the pragmatic justification of rules on grounds of coherence. Neither their truth nor its entertainment and ascertainment were an issue for it. So again, one could argue that no naturalistic limits were broached. Now, needless to say, these type of counters I've just entertained are themselves debatable, right? But I think what they do is they point to what I think the legacy of this Unified Science Group is that is usefully investigated. Namely, we could look at it as an invitation to reconsider what methodological naturalism may come to and in what sense it is open to an anti-metaphysical animus. Looking at that, I'll look at that momentarily, but one more point has to be clarified. What about the seemingly restrictive unity of science doctrine that gave this group their name? Now, here to be said is that for Carnap, the unity of science meant the unity of its language, its possession of what he called a homogeneous reduction base for many, but not all, terms of the different sciences. So from the mid-30s, he rejected wholesale reductionism. But as Neurath's often quoted example of forest fires showed, namely that it requires different sciences to be put together in application, this linguistic unity at the base was indispensable to science in practice by allowing the different sciences to combine in application. So importantly then, this Unified Science Group had no truck with the reductionist excesses of Oppenheim and Putnam still in 1958, who declared it a working hypothesis that the laws of science become reduced to the laws of some one discipline. For Carnap, the unity of laws was at best a distant ambition. For Neurath, it played no role at all. So in a sense, that's an example of how the reductivism was that made the Unified Science Group lot, the whole logical empiricists, so unattractive in the 60s and 70s, how they kind of avoided that. Okay, now back to this invitation, unfinished business. To formulate that group's invitation and frame the unfinished business claim most sharply without prejudging its outcome, I think it's best to focus on, not on the bipartite meta-theory conception, which I think in many ways is just common sense, that you have logic and empirical sciences working together, but rather on the idea that which really motivated them, that a radical break with the philosophical tradition was needed. You couldn't just carry on as in. And so the question then is, how did they understand it? And their guiding idea was, I think this, namely that metaphysics, hereafter M, metaphysics is to be rejected not just for projecting an illusory true reality behind the veil of appearance, and for making knowledge claims beyond all possibility of testing, but for holding thinking about knowledge captive in outdated categories. Metaphysics was to be rejected as an unwarranted demand for answers to questions that no longer merited scientific attention. Right? And it was to be replaced with a program of meta-theoretical constructivism which raised different questions altogether. Accordingly, the unfinished business, if that's the story, then whatever the unfinished business of this group may have been, it consists in this, that to determine and deploy resources of defense and counterattack against challenges to their own program, and to present at least some first constructive results of what they could put in place of what they rejected, right? So note if we go down this road, what we'll have to do, one of the things we'll have to do is we'll have to take seriously what made the Vienna Circle altogether so notorious, its campaign against metaphysics. Nowadays, well, we all know how that is viewed nowadays. But so the first thing to make that palatable is, I would say, we'll have to note the double-sidedness of this trope of anti-metaphysics, namely both of its ontological and its epistemological dimensions. And because this double-sidedness can lend us or allow us to give a double focus to how we look at what this unfinished business, if any, might be. First, their rejection of both realism and anti-realism, whether it was bluntly asserted by Neurath or more subtly promoted as deflationism by Carnap, stands for their ongoing radical challenge to the tradition. Metaphysics, bah. Yeah? Forget it. No more question. Second, their conviction that the new philosophy of science must be sharply distinguished from epistemology of old, as we know it, can be seen to stand for their working concern to establish a viable alternative. And therein, they also were trying to produce their first promising results. So accordingly, the unfinished question businesses are these. First, is there any mileage left in their anti-metaphysics? And second, whether what that separation of epistemology from philosophy of science was all about. Okay, now the first one is about the anti-metaphysics, and there I can be very short because I'll actually have to give you a rain check, because I do believe that the anti-metaphysics issue as faced by the Unified Science Group is still suitably represented best by a debate we all know very well, but know to be basically still unresolved, namely the debate between Carnap and Quine about, well, amongst other things, about whether metaphysics really can be left behind, right? And to resolve that now in the course of one slide, I won't even try. Let me just say what I would say if I had a whole afternoon, namely the 2 points there. First, I would say that considered in isolation, no advance is likely over the clash of ontological positions that are marked, the ontological positions that are marked by, on the one hand, Carnap's distinction of internal and external questions and Quine's notion of ontological commitment. Absent arguments for or against analyticity, on which that particular ontological debate really turned, and that's the one thing Carnap and Quine agreed about, right, that it turned on that, simply as freestanding notions, ontological commitment or logical frameworks, they lack I believe they lack the dialectical bite against the opposing position and cannot force non-question begging decisions either for or against deflationism or either for or against sort of ontological commitment kind of stuff. That all stands in the kind of thing. Given such further arguments, Carnap's intentionalism and deflationist explicationism, I think, can be defended, as I may have hinted earlier. But since the analyticity debate is not uniquely pertinent to philosophy of science, I must skip the details here and you don't want to hear about it anyway. So I'll offer you a rain check. Please talk to me after. The conclusion of the whole thing, this whole issue is the following, that if Quine's challenge to the anti-metaphysical agenda of that Unified Science Group is the one that matters, then completing it is a possibility. I say no more than that. So in that sense, the anti-metaphysical challenge of that group and its unfinished business is alive and well. albeit with the qualification that we have to bring in once we take into account Carnap's move on to the principle of tolerance, namely that its prescriptions and reconstructions must forego claiming exclusive validity beyond its self-delimited domain of cognitive significance, like in science. So that's the anti-metaphysical debate. It's still, as far as I can it's still motivating more in that. But that's also the challenge to traditional epistemology. The new philosophy of science was not just epistemology applied to particular subject matter. To deal with science, they also felt the central notion of justification and what it involves must be reconceived. First, there's a non-negotiable demand for publicity of knowledge claims and justification. Both must be testable on intersubjectively intelligible grounds, so there was no room left for authoritative privacy, as you have in everyday knowledge, or even Schlick thought he had for science. Next, there's Neurath's aforementioned opposition to truth. Note that makes much better sense in a quasi-epistemological context, for what Neurath actually did, and that's something interesting to note, is he advised that we should take as our basic aptitude in science something like tentative acceptance, not true belief. He spoke repeatedly of acknowledged statements, and you can find that in his theory of protocol sentences, which talks of them as scientific testimony, and places the empirical basis of scientific reasoning in the public realm as statements that are more or less consensually and fallibly accepted and stuff. So more than fallibilism is involved here, even more than anti-veritism. Both acceptance and belief, of course, are psychological acts and states, but distinguished in that the former involves reflection about the merits of the claims involved, whereas the latter can come about, need not, but can come about without reflection and involuntarily. So follows reasons and acceptance as the appropriate attitude towards scientific hypotheses. Shifting the focus from belief to acceptance would seem to involve radical reordering of the conceptual space of the theory of knowledge of old. How deep can also be seen an indication in Carnap's work. Carnap's logic of science, we saw, was purified of all empirical science, including psychology, and only dealt with the logical properties and relations of statements of science. So the only kind of justification that Carnap's logic of science can deal with is a form of propositional justification, which abstracts from everything but the logically derivable content of the propositions in question. And it can't really concern itself with doxastic justification, whether a particular knower is justified in making a claim. This may seem bizarre until the greater project is noted he was involved in, namely that this new philosophy of science deals with a different type of subject matter, not individual beliefs, not even collective beliefs, but collectively accepted sets of statements. Now, the anti-individualism of Carnap's logic of science is extreme, given and stems from his radical anti-psychologism. Given the full picture of science as a process and product requires, of course, as before, that his logic of science is complemented by the pragmatics of science, which does involve psychology, but that doesn't mean that then the bipartite theory falls back into epistemology of old, except at certain intermediate stages where you have to look into how this particular piece of testimony comes about. It's not, because for them it's not the justification of belief that's aimed at, but again, the public justification of instances of collective acceptance of sets of statements. So what this points to is a general tendency towards the socialization of the notion of epistemic agency, right? And in connection with this, I'd like to point out that, for instance, for Carnap, as things went on, Carnap came to discard the age-old epistemological presumption of methodological solipsism, and he rejected it for use in any practical reconstruction of the languages of science, much to the delight of Neurath, who had urged its dismissal for years. All right? One more thing before I rule it up. Whereas traditional epistemology is deeply individualist, the new Viennese philosophy of science is collectivist from the start. This is illustrated by where its justificatory authority is located. The social the socialization of the epistemic agency in science inverts a common picture of how internalist and externalist elements of knowledge are related. Note that the anti-foundationalism that informs Neurath's conception of protocol sentences prevents their being justified independently of any other statements. This contradicts a contemporary trend in naturalistic epistemology that allows perceptual beliefs to be non-inferentially justified due to their etiology alone. If it was still individual epistemology that practiced, with true beliefs the focus of justificatory activity, then such a denial of reliability, or reliabilism, which would ensue, would of course be problematic. But now, with that lot, the focus is on accepted sets of sentences. Their justification must be explicit and readily articulatable by at least the relevant specialist practitioners. So what I take from that is that not all externalist justification need be ruled out in science, but it's certainly ruled out at the collective institutional level, considered as a social practice with a certain division of labor. Scientific rationality proceeds as a conception with a conception of justification that is internalist overall. Any externalism is only locally and ultimately can be justified from within the institution by other words. So, preliminarily concluding a few things, some of the views of the Unified Science Group have become standard. Of course, it's anti-fallibilism, a few other things, but what about the unfinished business? Well, the austere versions of Carnap's propositional justification appears owed to the division only of the labor between that's due to the bipartite meta-theory conception and does not appear to have been emulated except in certain forms of so-called formal epistemology, but not wildly as far as I can see, in philosophy of science. On the other hand, wholly independently of Neurath's suggestion, the idea that acceptance but not belief should be the fundamental attitude for philosophy of science has been taken up by Jonathan Cohen and developed by Catherine Elgin, but not more widely in the discipline either. And here I know about Van Fraassen, but Van Fraassen has acceptance just for a particular set of claims, not generally. So the Jonathan Cohen and Elgin model of acceptance is quite different. And also, independently of the Unified Science Group, the pragmatics of science, which includes psychology, sociology, history of science, seems to be in pretty rude health, given that attention to social aspects of science has moved from the fringes of the more orthodox philosophy of science in the 1950s to become a multifaceted, legitimate current concern nowadays. Now, even neutrals may view that both of these last two uptakes could perhaps be counted as at least partial vindications of the USG's constructive program. By contrast, whether their anti-metaphysical campaign still looks promising, while it still looks promising for enthusiasts, neutrals may consider the outcome open at best. Last question, but would any further revivalists' efforts be worthwhile anyway? Well, I won't answer that because I'll leave that for discussion. My time is up. Thank you for your attention.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Thomas. This was really great and really interesting, and a lot of it seems to me to be entirely right. I wanted to ask you about something that you said you didn't really want to talk more about, which is the relationship between Carnap and Quine. Because you suggested early on that you think that Quine just misunderstands Carnap in an important sense. And I've always found that kind of like reading unpersuasive, these guys had 20 years of discussions to work through this misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It seems plausible that Quine would have understood him.
I think so, yes. I think so. Quine, when you look at it, for instance, Quine thinks, for instance, Quine takes it or there's indications that Quine takes it that Carnap couldn't live with the indeterminacy of translation because there's relevant footnotes in the bits in chapter 2 of Word and Object. Now, as far as I can see, and I've argued that in a paper, which, anyway, but still in the work, that's not true. Carnap is quite happy with the indeterminacy of translation. Carnap, in fact, recognizes something he calls intentional vagueness and refers to that in that 1955 paper where he talks about the assignment of intentions to natural languages kind of stuff. And what intentional vagueness is all about is that the determinacy that the semanticist who, in the process of explication, assigns determinate meanings to expressions of an informant, say, right? That they, as a matter of fact, make up the determinacy. When you ask that informant, the informant himself said, I don't know what I would say about X, Y, Z, but in order to get the logic nice and tight and strict, he has to fill it up. So that would be one example of that, of Carnap doing that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I have also a question about something that you mentioned very briefly, and that is that according to the Left Vienna Circle or the Unity of Science group, that there is a compatibility between the pragmatics of science and the logic of science.
Yeah.
And as far as I understand it, they never really got around figuring out how exactly these two components are compatible.
Well, this is...
And do you think that unfinished business is exactly figuring out how exactly to combine an empirical investigation of science with a logical investigation of science?
Well, I would agree. One of the things we'd love from them is an extensive discussion precisely of that, right? But we have enough indications of little remarks by Carnap here and there that sort of, for instance, you look at the very end of the logical syntax of language by Carnap, and there he points out that all his language construction there is in the aid of making science more effective. Now, that basically means he produces these linguistic frameworks or whatever he does. He produces he sees himself in the process of developing formal instruments that can then be employed in science when it goes about its explanatory and predictive business. Likewise, later on at the very end, in fact, at the very end in the Schilp volume, Philipp Frank takes pot shots at Carnap and saying, yeah, you and metaphysics and stuff. How do you show metaphysics to be wrong? Well, you show it to be a meaning and semantic analysis, and it all goes up in smoke. But that's not the point. In order to see that, you have to do some pragmatics. You can then say what it is in their, broadly speaking, situation of life that compels people to fall for this metaphysical boo-ha. Right? And basically, Carnap responds and say, well, I totally agree, but that was Neurath was doing, and look, division of labor. I can't, I've got enough on my hands with what I'm doing. So I fully agree with it. It would be lovely to have a systematic treatise of that, but certainly from their aim that the two, and on a certain maybe altogether commonsensical level, that somehow or other the two have to go together seems fairly clear. But thank you.
Thomas.
Yeah.
Excellent, fabulous. Maybe this is my version of Hans's question, because I was very struck by that sentence in one of your slides about the socialization of epistemic agency. which sounds to me very much like what David Bloor is trying to do to Karl Popper and Popper's epistemology without a knowing subject. But another person who has an epistemology of science without a knowing subject is Carnap. So maybe you can run the same line, but this is my version of Fans's question. If you look at it, it's a little bit hard to read that into Carnap, despite his genuflections in these various places, because internally to the development of Carnap's philosophy, epistemic agency comes in the notion of subjectivity in the Aufbau. Yeah. And the question of how you get to objectivity from subjectivity. Yeah. Ultimately, he decides that that's just a bad question. It's not that we're going to have subjectivity or agency placed somewhere else, but that we're not going to talk about that anymore. And the sort of representation you get is representation in logical systems, which don't have any relation to minds. Minds drop out. So I'm wondering how much we really want to say in the Carnap case that this is not a move towards formalization, but a move towards some form of socialization of the epistemic agent.
Right. Well, I would like to stick with that kind of socialization kind of business, because first it also is with I wouldn't want to put Carnap as close to Popper. Oh, sorry. Apologies. I wouldn't like to put Carnap as close to Popper, in as much it's not without a knowing subject, but if anything with a collective subject. Right? And that already makes a lot of difference. Because once you have a collective subject, then you have to talk about, well, not exactly collective subjectivity, but as I indicated on a couple of slides back, psychology can't be falling out of the picture altogether. This is, again, where I think it's important that the logic of science, that Carnap's austere logic of science, right, was ultimately meant to be complemented by this pragmatics of science, where then, indeed, questions for a brief moment, questions of the justification of individual belief play a role, and I can pinpoint that, if you like, in Neurath's conception of protocol sentences, where there's a stage, ultimately he gets just to statements that are being uttered and at some time by somebody, and then get accepted by the community into the archive of data statements or what have you, right? But at some point in the generation of these utterances, one of the preconditions before that hopefully protocol gets accepted as protocol, one of the conditions for that acceptance is that, in fact, that utterance stands in the expression of perceptual content on part of the testifier has to stand in the appropriate, in what can roughly gather is appropriate causal contact to the environment. And that, of course, is a question that concerns the genesis or the genealogy of an individual belief. But it doesn't stop there, but that's, as it were, just the intermediate stage that then gets us to, well, that's preconditions that then gets us to the state, and then the rest of the, so to speak, philosophy of science is done then up at the level of accepted sentences. Does that help to? Thank you.
The final, very short question.
Oh, yeah. I'm struck by this claim that acceptance but not belief should be the fundamental attitude for philosophy. Yeah. Because this does show up in the values in science literature, that acceptance is the right thing to do.
In the what literature?
Values in science literature. That acceptance, if we're interested in values in science, we're going to focus on acceptance because acceptance has to do with being used in practical reasoning rather than belief. So I wonder, like, how this might fit in with the story you're telling here.
That's interesting. I'll have a look at it. You'll give me. I'll ask you for some sort of references. I haven't seen it in there, although I have looked. Obviously, I haven't covered that debate in toto, but it would be very interesting. Here it depends again. From what you say, it seems to be quite congenial, but different people use acceptance in different ways. Thus, as I indicated briefly, we of course all know Bas van Fraasen's empirical realism, only acceptance via theoretical claims, not belief, blah, blah, blah. That is a... Maybe he means the same by acceptance, but this limitation of acceptance to just one subclass of scientific proposition is different. So it would be interesting to pursue that further. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so let's thank Thomas again.